Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here this afternoon. We appreciate that you've joined us for this panel, and I'll start off by introducing myself and then lean into it. My name is Malcolm Cockwell. I'm the Managing Director of Halliburton Forest and a registered professional forester. And among other things, I have the pleasure of serving as the President and Chair of Forests Ontario. But most importantly, and perhaps most relevant to this afternoon, I am the moderator of this panel. So as I said, we appreciate that you've joined us to hear today. The panel is Sustainable Forestry, an ally in the fight against climate change. Two important topics that closely complement each other. And I know that I'm personally looking forward to hearing our distinguished speakers speak to exactly that. Before I put our speakers on the stage, I have a few housekeeping items to address. The first is that throughout the session, please feel free to engage with other attendees in the chat box beside the main stage. You can also submit any questions in the Q&A box or upvote any submitted questions that you'd like to see answered. All the questions asked will be anonymous, and there will be a Q&A session at the end of the speakers where we'll try to respond to as many questions as we can. I will admit that I have my own burning questions that I would love to ask these distinguished panelists, but we will prioritize questions from the audience this afternoon. If you happen to experience any technical difficulties during the panel or during the Q&A session, feel free to visit the FAQ page in the upper left-hand menu of your screen, and hopefully we can get it resolved for you. So I'll start by moving straight into an introduction of Dr. Werner Kurtz, who is a senior research scientist at the Canadian Forest Service, Natural Resources Canada in Victoria, BC. He leads the development of Canada's National Forest Carbon Monitoring, Accounting and Reporting System and the Wildfire and Carbon Project of the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. His research focuses on carbon dynamics in forests and harvested wood products and opportunities for climate change mitigation. He obtained his PhD in forest ecology from the University of British Columbia and is an honorary doctorate from the Swedish Land University. Dr. Kurtz is an international fellow of the Royal Swedish Academy of Agriculture and Forestry, and we're thrilled to have him today on this panel. Over to you, Dr. Kurtz.
Thank you, Malcolm, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to give today's presentation, which I hope you can see now. Can somebody confirm that you can see it?
It's great.
Great, thank you. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to give the presentation and participate on the panel today. What I want to speak to you is about forest sector contributions to net zero pathways. I want to speak about both some of the risks and opportunities. And let me start with the high level issues. We all understand that global warming is a concern. What the IPCC has identified in several recent reports is that in order to limit global warming at any temperature, we must reach net zero emissions globally. In order to keep the average global temperature increase to below 2 degrees centigrade, we need to achieve net zero emissions by the middle of this century and net negative emissions in the second half of this century. What that means is that eventually CO2 removals from the atmosphere must be greater than the emissions that we cause. And that means we have to simultaneously greatly reduce the emissions from fossil fuel and cement manufacturing and other causes of emissions, including agriculture. And we must increase the land sector sinks so that we can balance the two to get to zero or eventually to net negative emissions. And it is for that reason that around the world, governments are looking at the land sector and at forests to how they will contribute to these future removals. However, forests, while they have a role to play, are also at increasing risks from climate change impacts. And so those are the sort of two tensions that I want to speak about today. As many of you may know, over the last 30 years, we've been working on carbon modeling, and over the last 20 years with the Canadian Forest Service, we have developed a National Forest Carbon Monitoring, Accounting and Reporting System. This system is used by Canada to achieve a couple of objectives. One is to report on past greenhouse gas dynamics and also to make projections about future carbon dynamics, including analyses of mitigation and adaptation strategies and the outcome of projected mitigation activities. The system is applied to the managed forests of Canada, here shown in the darker color in the lower part of the diagram. The managed forest is about 226 million hectares, and for the purpose of greenhouse gas reporting, it is defined as the area that is subject to human activities, including harvesting, but also conservation areas and fire suppression. And it's really the fire suppression boundary that gives you the northern boundary in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and places east. There's an additional 121 million hectares of forests where we only track land use changes. So if a mine or a reservoir is built in the unmanaged forest, we track the emissions from that. At the core of our system is the carbon budget model of the Canadian forest sector that we started developing in 1989. The third version of this tool is used to represent these 226 million hectares of forests with about 3 million inventory records that describe the forest conditions in Canada. We drive the model with about 100,000 growth curves that are compiled from thousands of permanent and temporary sample plots maintained by provinces, territories, and federal agencies and industry over many decades. What this modeling tool does is it keeps track of carbon in biomass, in dead organic matter, and in soil. So all of the ecosystem carbon pools. It calculates the annual gains and losses, tracking harvesting and other forest management activity, as well as natural disturbances. And Canada also has a specific system to track deforestation, where we monitor land use changes, both deforestation and afforestation. And then we combine that with ecological modeling parameters to generate estimates of emissions and removals. Here is an example of what we report, of what we show when we estimate greenhouse gas emissions and removals. This is for the forest land, remaining forest land, so it excludes deforestation and afforestation. And in this graph, I'm not including the harvested wood products emissions. I'll do that in a moment. The x-axis shows you the years. The y-axis shows you on the right-hand side the area disturbed by forest management, so predominantly harvesting, but also other forest management activities, wildfires, and insects. And on the left-hand side, you see the emissions. Negative value is a sink, removing carbon from the atmosphere. A positive value is a source. And there's a couple of features here. First of all, in the 1990s, we were a sustained sink throughout the forests, were a sustained sink throughout the period. But we also notice huge interannual variability. If you compare 1992 to 1995, we already see in excess of 200 million tons per year interannual variability in the emissions and removals associated largely by wildfires. We also see that in the middle, in the 2000s, the mountain pine beetle outbreak and other impacts have continuously reduced our sink. And in most recent years, we had a series of catastrophic fires across the country, showing many years now where even without accounting for harvested wood products emissions, the forest is already a source. And sadly, this trend is continuing because we already know, we don't have the data analyzed yet, but we know that 2020 was a mild fire year, but 2021, we have burned 3.6 million hectares of forests in the managed forest. That is 1.8 times the previous record of 2015. So we can already predict that the trend that we observe in this diagram will continue with increasing emissions from our forests. In order to better understand the anthropogenic influence and the natural disturbance impacts, we take the blue line that you just saw and we partition it into two components, that what we call the anthropogenic category, and in red, the natural category. The natural category comprises 54 million hectares of forests that were affected by wildfires, either in the past or recently, and we, as well as affected by insect disturbances causing more than 20% mortality. What Canada does is we report the emissions and removals, so the subsequent regrowth of lands that were affected by natural disturbances, in this natural category, and we report the anthropogenic emissions and removals in the anthropogenic category, the black line. And what that now allows us to do is we can better determine how changes in human behavior, such as changes in harvest rates or planting of 2 billion trees or other natural climate solution efforts, will bend the black curve. But it will also help us better understand and quantify how changes in natural disturbances will continue to influence the red curve. And as I said earlier, we're currently anticipating that by 2021, we will reach the highest point on that growth on that curve of all of them. So natural climate solutions are in discussion. We will hear next from Ronnie Druver. And I here just want to give one highlight of 3 of the 24 pathways that were published in this Natural Climate Solutions for Canada study that involved 38 authors from 16 institutions. And as I said, Ronnie will speak to that in detail. I'll just pick 3 briefly, the ones that our team was involved in: restoration of forest cover, improved forest management, and avoided forest conversions, or the avoidance of deforestation. And I don't have time to go into all of the details. I just want you to focus on the key messages here. And that is that by 2030, every one of these activities, so the converting, restoration of forest cover, improved forest management, and avoided forest conversion, each have contributions to our greenhouse gas balance that are in the order of less than 5 to less than 10 megatons of CO2e. So keep those numbers in mind. We're talking about 5 to 10 megatons of CO2e annual contributions. I'll come back to that in a minute. But we are also involved in many other studies. We have recently published a paper with my postdoc Sheng Ji and Paul McFarland, formerly from UBC, now retired, where we demonstrate that how and where we use the wood that is harvested in Canada matters greatly. This is a complex graph. I won't go into all of the details here, but I just want to highlight a couple of things. If we look at British Columbia's projected greenhouse gas emissions to 2050, not including wildfire variations, we get a base case of this graph here on the left. If we make theoretical assumptions of, if we used all of the wood that was harvested in British Columbia, what would be to produce biofuels, we could just meet the demand of liquid transportation fuels for British Columbia only. We would greatly increase the quick emissions to the atmosphere. And if in contrast, we would use all of the wood that we harvested in building materials, we would greatly reduce our emissions. Sorry, I got this the wrong way around. This is the one with the construction material. So this is the one where we reduce emissions greatly. This is the fuel one where we increase emissions. Apologies. If we just look at what's happening in British Columbia and using all of the wood domestically, then what we could achieve is about 4 megatons of CO2 per year to 2050. So again, it's in the 5 megaton range. And what this study has shown us is that the indicators that matter are, how long is carbon retained when we extract it from the forest, and clearly, and the second dimension is the displacement factor or substitution benefit. That means when we use wood instead of bioenergy or other materials, how much emissions are avoided. And obviously, when we go to structural building products, we achieve the highest mitigation benefits because now what we have is long-term carbon retention and high displacement factors because we avoid the emissions from steel and concrete. So how we use wood greatly matters. Now, in this context of natural climate solutions, conservation is often proposed as a way to achieve greater carbon sinks. And so we have been doing a study over the last few years with Parks Canada, in which Tara Sharma and us did analysis of forest carbon stocks and their dynamics in 31 forested national parks across Canada. We used the generic carbon budget model, the most recent version of our carbon budget model, to analyze the carbon dynamics for a 31-year period at over 5.6 million hectares and at 30 meters resolution. So this is a massive undertaking. And what we found is a bit surprising, because throughout the 1990s, we observed an annual and cumulative carbon sinks. Not surprising. There's no harvesting going on. In the 2000s, we have seen years of gains and carbon losses, but we have not observed any cumulative additional gains. In the 2010s, the last decade of the analysis, what we see is that with climate change impacts, the losses due to insects and wildfire have greatly increased. In fact, by 2020, there was only a tiny cumulative carbon gain, and the greenhouse gas balance, which includes emissions of methane and N2O, became a cumulative net source. These results are dominated by 4 large Western parks, and particularly wood buffalo. Some of the Eastern parks were sinks and remain sinks throughout the period. But overall, the park system became a net cumulative greenhouse gas carbon source, and this is before the 2021 fires are added. So this is a warning, because it means that a conservation-based mitigation strategy must consider risks from wildfires, insects, and climate change, as well as other disturbances, before we can conclude that conservation alone will enhance carbon sinks or, in fact, be able to maintain them. And with climate change, as we saw in this analysis, they may, in fact, become sources. So in contrast, we also just published a few weeks ago a study with the International Boreal Forest Research Association, or IPFA, where we synthesized biomass changes in 6 boreal countries. In some places, we're also able to look at dead organic matter and salt carbon stocks, but we don't have enough data to do that for all 6 boreal countries. In the graphs here, I show you, using the Finland example at the bottom, the change in biomass stocks from 1990 to about 2016. As well as the cumulative harvest. And taking Finland as an example here, what that shows is that over that period, in the forests, in the managed forests of Finland, biomass carbon stocks have increased while producing this amount of cumulative harvest in units of carbon. In Sweden, even more extreme, about 25% or so of the total initial biomass stock in 1990 had been harvested by 2017. But over that period, biomass carbon stocks have still increased. So and Norway, a very similar picture at a different scale. So what that shows is that intensive forest management in the boreal forests of the Nordic countries has resulted in large transfers of carbon to society and increasing biomass carbon stocks. Now, we have very different situations in the 3 countries of Alaska, Canada, and Russia, Alaska being part of the US, of course. Time series is shorter in Alaska. We use different methodologies here because of a lack of data. But what we see clearly is there's no harvesting occurring here, but there are many wildfires occurring. And as a result, carbon stocks have declined. In Canada, we have a declining overall biomass carbon stock, according to these analyses, but still when we add the lateral transfer of harvested wood, the impact is still a sink over this whole period, although we have seen in the previous graphs that this in recent years has changed to a source. And then in Russia, where the carbon stocks are much, much bigger because of the area involved, there also appears to be a small increase in carbon stocks. But the big differences between the 3 on the upper side and the 3 countries on the lower side of this graph are the differences in the impacts of wildfires and insects. Because wildfires are pretty much excluded in Norway, Finland, and Sweden, they're not in Alaska, Canada, and Russia. So to put this into perspective, just how big the emissions from wildfires are, and this is the net balance of emissions and subsequent removals, is, if I remind you, in British Columbia, the 17 and 18 wildfires, the emissions there were 3 times the emissions from all other sectors combined in British Columbia. At the national level, if we look at the net balance of emissions and removals for the disturbance category, we have annual emissions of about 180 megatons of carbon. Okay, so that's at least an order of magnitude greater than any of the mitigation outcomes that we have achieved with the various natural climate solutions in the previous. So this has then, it's very clear that the disturbance impacts can exceed the mitigation benefits by an order of magnitude or more. that carbon uptake is always a slow process while fire emissions are immediate and rapid. And what it also shows is that the mitigation actions that we can implement through natural climate solutions always affect only a small proportion of the forest every year, while climate change impacts will affect all of the forests every year. And we haven't even started to look at the details of the impacts of, say, warming and greater decomposition rates. We have started a project with the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions on Wildfire and Carbon to explore what natural climate solutions opportunities we may have that allow us to minimize or reduce wildfire emissions, increase carbon sinks, while at the same time enhancing and creating a bioeconomy in British Columbia. There are many opportunities to remove low-grade biomass that contributes to the high fuel loads we see in many parts of Western North America, and use these to ultimately reduce wildfire risks, but also to create bioeconomic opportunities. This is a collaboration with colleagues in the US Forest Service, UBC, Parks Canada, and BC. So all of this then begs the question of whether or not we should pursue natural climate solutions. And the simple answer is yes, we must. In the words of the IPCC, every ton matters, every year matters, and every degree matters. And therefore, whatever we can do to reduce emissions and enhance things, we should do, as long as it's sensible. What that means is that we need to develop mitigation pathways that anticipate climate change impacts and act accordingly. We need to have very realistic expectations of the magnitude and the timing of the mitigation benefits that we can achieve, and we must not use natural climate solutions with uncertain outcomes as an excuse to not reduce fossil fuel emissions. So in conclusion then, it is clear that despite climate change impacts, Canada's forest sector offers opportunities to enhance sinks and contribute to negative emissions, and this is in part achieved through providing society with millions of tons of carbon in timber and in fiber that we can deploy to achieve mitigation outcomes. We do fear that climate change impacts on Canada's forests are projected to further increase future wildfires and area burned and emissions. We therefore need to act now to implement various natural climate solutions, but in particular to reduce future wildfire emissions through mitigation and adaptation activities. And most importantly, let's not forget that is we must reduce fossil fuel emissions rapidly, because whatever we do with land sector carbon sinks alone cannot solve the climate problem. Thank you very much. Publications are on the internet, in the CFS bookstore, and under Google Scholar and ResearchGate. And with that, I stop sharing and turn it over to Malcolm at exactly 20 minutes.
Well done, Dr. Kurtz. Thank you. Very informative, and I'm sure will prompt many questions from the audience. However, next up, we will have Dr. Ronnie Drever, who I'll introduce and who will then take over. Ronnie Drever works as a senior conservation scientist for Nature United. He started with the Nature Conservancy in 2007 and provides science leadership and technical expertise to Nature United's place-based conservation and climate projects. Dr. Drever completed a PhD in biology at Université du Québec at Montreal and has written dozens of technical reports, popular science pieces, and peer-reviewed publications on applied ecology, forestry, and landscape ecology. Over to you, Dr. Drever.
Thanks very much, Malcolm, and thanks to Forest Ontario for inviting me to present to you today. It's my absolute pleasure to be here. I'm going to be talking about natural climate solutions, and I'm actually quite happy that the answer to Vern's question was yes, we must, because had it been a different answer, maybe my presentation would land a bit flat. So I'm coming to you today from Western Quebec, which is the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe. And I'm going to be speaking to you about natural climate solutions with a little bit of an introductory bit as to what are natural climate solutions as a bit of background into the central theme of this session, which is about the role of forests in climate change mitigation. So what are natural climate solutions? Simply put, this term gets used a lot, and it's really a subset of nature-based solutions to climate change. But natural climate solutions, really, they fall squarely in the mitigation side. So they're really interventions or actions that we can take in our natural systems, in our grasslands, forests, etc., that either avoid emissions from land use change or increase the sequestration capacity or the ability of our natural systems to take back carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And it should be stated pretty much every time we talk about these things is that they're not a substitute for actual emissions reductions related to a decreased use of fossil fuels and increased use of renewables, etc. And natural climate solutions really came to a fore scientifically, starting roughly about 2017, when colleagues from the Nature Conservancy published a study that essentially documented the opportunity for natural climate solutions to provide about 1/3 of the cost-effective mitigation potential that's required to meet our climate goals globally and hold global warming below dangerous thresholds. So really, what are natural climate solutions? More precisely, there's a series of criteria that we like to essentially make clear. One is that they should be additional. They need to be different from what we were doing in the past to offer mitigation potential. Ideally, they're near term, meaning that the mitigation potential that they offer be able to, it offers mitigation potential in the 2030 timeframe. Then they need to be mindful that we're not creating other problems by trying to solve a different one, meaning that then in their design, we need to include social and biodiversity safeguards. So often there's trade-offs among these things when we're trying to implement them. And so in terms of biodiversity safeguards, I'm thinking more specifically about not planting trees in grassy biomes, or avoid conversion of land use that's used for agricultural production, that type of thing. They should be cost effective, at least as cost effective as other methods for climate mitigation. And this is picking up on a theme that Werner mentioned. We need to consider permanence, meaning that locking carbon in natural systems is subject to natural change, and so we need to make sure that we're mindful of those risks. And one of the things that defines natural climate solutions as different from other mitigation approaches like carbon taxes, etc., is that they can provide co-benefits to people and nature, to biodiversity, to oil, air, and water health, and soil health. And because this is really about Canada's role and Canada's nature in climate change, it's really important that we include Indigenous peoples, both in the design and implementation of natural climate solutions. A lot of the area that we've identified as being suitable for natural climate solutions is the home of Indigenous peoples who have inherent rights and cultures and traditions and knowledge that should be included. And this approach can help us in our journey of reconciliation with our Indigenous peoples in Canada. As Werner mentioned, and Werner's one of the co-authors on the study I'll be talking about, as is Ben Falwad, who's on this panel. We brought together, my colleagues and I, in particular Susan Cook-Patton, who was the co-lead author from my parent organization, the Nature Conservancy. We started looking around just who was publishing in this field in Canada, and we brought together quite a stellar research team of luminaries from both the NGO sector, from the academic sector and government sector, to start to essentially document the opportunity for natural climate solutions in Canada. The result was this publication you see on the screen now, which was published in June 2021 in a leading journal. And it's perhaps the most sophisticated assessment to date on the potential role for nature in Canada to be an ally against rapid climate change. The key finding is that natural climate solutions, if implemented starting today, can yield about 78 megatons of annual emissions reductions every year in 2030. So this represents quite a lot of potential mitigation potential and potentially an important contribution to Canada's goals under the Paris Agreement. It's also a potential contribution to net zero emissions by 2050. And to give you a sense of the scope, it's roughly equivalent to 11% of Canada's annual emissions, or equivalent to heavy emissions from heavy industry in Canada every year, or as this slide states, the emissions from powering every home in Canada for about 3 years. This chart here is kind of the marquee figure from the study, and it documents really all of the parts of natural climate solutions that we tried to assess. You'll see on the left-hand side the 24 different pathways of action that we analyzed in the 4 different broad ecosystem types. In the gray bars, those indicate the mitigation potential available in 2030. And then the thin line refers to the uncertainty associated with that mitigation potential. And the gray shading, the mitigation potential that's available at different price points. But given this audience, I thought it would be useful to look at the parts of the pathways that we analyzed that dealt with trees and forests. And so if you sum those up, they can yield about 20 megatons per year in 2030 and about 64 megatons per year in 2050. A lot of this is quite cost effective, meaning that it can be achieved at cost of less than $100 per ton. So 76% of that opportunity is available at that price point. 20 megatons is roughly equivalent to the emissions from all of Manitoba, for instance, or 4.2 million cars and their annual emissions. So I'm going to talk more specifically about the forest and tree-related pathways. We first looked at improved forest management, and this was quite a sophisticated analysis that was led by Werner's team. And it essentially involved 3 different components. We looked at the mitigation potential associated with old forest conservation. And so asking questions about what mitigation potential is available if we reduce forest harvest relative to business levels by about 10%. And we aim that reduction at the oldest forest stands that are slated for logging in any given year. Then we ask questions about how much mitigation potential is available if we increase the growth rates of trees coming up after forest harvest by about 10%. And third, we ask questions about the increased wood realization potential. So how much mitigation potential is available if we shift part of our product mix away from short-lived wood products like paper and packaging to longer-lived wood products like building materials. And in sum, that yielded about 8 megatons per year in 2030 from the sum total of these 3 different pathways of action. About half of that available potential is from old forest conservation. And about the remainder roughly equivalent to about half of that or a quarter of the total in the enhanced regeneration side, and about a quarter of that in the wood utilization bit. And what's interesting to note here is that, again, a lot of this is quite cost effective, less than 81% of that mitigation potential available at less than $100 a ton. Next up, we looked at avoided forest conversion. So this isn't logging per se. It's essentially where forest conversion means where you take forest cover and it transform for a different type of land cover. For it could be trees. Parking lots or agricultural land, that type of thing. It basically goes from forest to non-forest. And so we ask questions about what mitigation potential is available if you stop the conversion in Canada of about half of the forest conversion that happens in Canada, which is about 40,000 hectares per year. We documented that there's about 4 megatons available of mitigation potential in 2030, and about half of that at less than $100 a ton. And then tree planting is a topic of high interest to this crowd, I'm sure, and to many people across Canada, in particular the federal government, who has created a 2 billion tree initiative. And so this research really was in a bit of a service to that policy goal. And so we documented, first of all, we did a lot of work to try and understand where you could grow forest cover in Canada to go from non-forest cover to forest cover. And that analysis suggests there's about 4 million hectares that are available for tree planting in Canada right now. And so that's roughly equivalent to about 6 billion trees. But one of the interesting findings about this work is that by 2030, all this activity, even if we planted all those 4 million hectares, yields very little mitigation potential, less than 1 megaton per year. Of course, that picture is completely different if you look at a 2050 timeframe, by which time the trees have had a chance to hit their photosynthetic stride and become really excellent machines for sequestering carbon. And so that's about 25 megatons per year by 2050. And then we ask questions about trees in agricultural landscapes. This analysis looked at 4 different types of interventions that we can do in our agricultural landscapes. One is to combine trees with crops, which is called tree intercropping, and that potential does suggest there's about 800,000 hectares in Ontario and Quebec available for that opportunity. Then we looked at silvopasture, which is combining trees, pastures, and livestock, and again, about 1 million hectares available for that across Canada. And then we looked at, did another lot of GIS or mapping related to identifying the opportunity with planting trees in our streamside areas. And there's about 200,000 hectares available across Canada for that. And then we looked at protecting shelter belts in our prairie provinces and that potential. All of that suggests that there's about 8 megatons per year available, with a lot of that actually available for less than $50 a ton, so very cost-effective mitigation. Recent work that we're doing on this file pertains to what we call the NCS hierarchy. So not all these climate solutions that relate to nature are created equal, and they vary in important ways in key aspects, including the time frame in which the impact that we expect will take place, how cost effective they are, the co-benefits that they bring to biodiversity, those type of things. And so in general, we're proposing a hierarchy that goes protect, manage, restore, under the general principle that really protection offers high near-term mitigation with high co-benefits. Management offers a lot of near-term mitigation potential with relatively fewer co-benefits, but more cost-effectively. And that restoration, really, the mitigation potential is in the sort of longer-term time frame, and those co-benefits, at least in the immediate time frame, are less so. And so if we look at the pathways that I talked about shortly ago, and how they fall into this protect, manage, restore bin, really there's about 8 megatons per year in the protect from the pathways you see listed here, about 11 in our manage bin, and about 1%, or 1 I should say, in 2030 from the interventions that you see listed there. And so to summarize, I think really to speak sort of plainly about the role that forestry and forest management and trees can play in being an ally against climate change, it's really clear that we need to protect our carbon capital. Conservation of old forest and carbon-rich areas like forested peatlands, and avoid conversion of existing tree cover offer the highest near-term mitigation potential. Managing trees in agricultural landscapes offers a lot of mitigation potential that also is cost-effective and allows production landscapes that are important for food and other ecosystem services to continue to do so while delivering benefits for climate change. We need to restore forests and by tree planting and other interventions. And this really needs to start right away if we want to see any benefit by 2050. Then it's really important when we're thinking about nature-based mitigation to consider the co-benefits that come along for the ride. The environmental, economic, and social benefits that they bring along should be important considerations in the design of natural climate solutions and really make them substantially different from other interventions for climate mitigation. And absolutely respecting Indigenous rights and authority is really important. As I mentioned, the opportunities for forest-related natural climate solutions in Canada occur in the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples, and they need to be part of the solution. And this is a quick tip of the hat to our supporters. So thanks very much for your attention, and be happy to take questions when that happens. Cheers.
Thank you, Dr. Drever. Many questions popped up in the chat, which I'm sure we all look forward to getting to. So thank you for that. I'm next going to introduce Dr. Darren Sleep. At the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, Darren is responsible for the incorporation of up-to-date and scientifically rigorous content across all of SFI's pillars, ensuring that SFI's work is grounded in thoughtful, science-based knowledge and communications. He serves on several regional, national, and international scientific advisory boards, including the Committee on the Status of Species at Risk in Ontario and the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe's Boreal Forest team of experts. Dr. Sleep brings expertise on wildlife management, species at risk, and forest science policy integration to SFI, along with a passion for conservation and scientific communication to the public, and regularly publishes in the scientific as well as popular literature. Dr. Sleep has a BSc from the University of New Brunswick, an MSc from the University of Regina, and a PhD from the University of Guelph. Over to you, Dr. Sleep.
Thank you, Malcolm. And thank you to the folks at Forest Ontario for the invitation to speak today. I hope everyone can see my screen. One can never tell these days. Sometimes with Zoom, it's so much fun. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of that middle bubble that Ronnie talked about how we can use sustainable forest management to combat climate change and what we can do to enhance that and what SFI is doing specifically. See if I can make this move. For those of you who are not familiar with SFI, we have this vision of a world that values and benefits sustainably managed forests. And we do this through our mission to advance sustainability through forest-focused collaborations. So while you may hear about me talking about a lot of the results of the work we're doing, I have to give a tip of my hat now to the many organizations we work with to advance this work and do these projects. As was mentioned in the introduction, my work as a scientist within the organization supports the work of our various pillars, our work streams within SFI. So you may know SFI as a forest management standard, and certainly a lot of my work is directed there. But my primary work and where I hang my hat is in the conservation realm. But I also provide a lot of support to our education initiatives, which provides a curriculum for kids through K to 12 and into mentoring of university students and the like, as well as to some of the less privileged communities that we work with and support that benefit from forestry as well. Climate change is obviously the reason we're talking today and what so many people focus on. And we know that sustainably managed forests capture carbon faster than unmanaged forests. And we saw that with Werner's presentation, looking at the recent IBFA report. And we know that young trees planted and tended after older trees are harvested will capture carbon faster. I really like the way Ronnie described that when they hit their carbon capturing stride after a while, and that's a really good way to think about forests. Now we know within the SFI footprint alone, there is more carbon stored than would be emitted by 30 billion cars in a year. For those of you who are keeping score, that's about a third larger than all the cars that are currently existing and running on the planet right now. So, and I should point out that is a conservative estimate of what our footprint stores, because recent work from McMaster University and WWF has showed that our footprint in Canada actually stores more than we previously estimated. So we're looking forward to updating that number and showing a more accurate assessment. But it's not just about how much carbon is stored in those footprints, but it's also about the forest resilience. We know, and Werner talked about this extensively, about the disturbances that are coming as a result of climate change. And we really need to think about how can we manage our forest to be more resilient to those disturbances that are coming. So we've done some work, again, it's all about collaboration. We've done some work with Manomet to look at forest climate resiliency and what can be done from a management point of view to enhance resiliency of forests to these disturbances. This project was really useful in establishing baseline conditions and understanding where forests are currently at and how they're changing as a result of climate change. And then for assessing the change that is happening and developing tools to monitor its effects over time. This is really useful in terms of informing forest managers as to how they can prepare for what is likely to be coming, their direction. We've also done, when we think about this at the scale of SFI, we have roughly 150 million hectares in North America. And we know that that scale gives us an ability to really impact what's going on in terms of our climate footprint, as well as other ways. So we 370 million acres, if you're thinking in the Old English or American system, 150 million hectares. It's a huge footprint. But we've got this grassroots involvement of organizations like our standards implementation committees at the state or provincial or regional level. We've got $1.8 billion in research that we've been able to harness to go into forest management. This is combined with the work, the money we've put in, as well as the money that certified organizations put in, combined with leverage funding. So we've really helped move the needle on good forest research that's done. And through our education programs, we've reached 150 million students since PLT began in the US. So having that scale really makes a difference in terms of how you can affect forest management and thereby climate and all these other metrics that we care about in terms of sustainable development. We also know that over time, things change. Companies make different decisions on where they want to hang their hat as far as certification goes. But we've seen a steady increase in our footprint across North America. And again, with every acre, every hectare that we add to this pile, it gives us more capacity to affect positive change in terms of climate and other methods. If you want to think about just Canada, it's a very similar graph. You can see that we've increased our footprint, since the initiation of SFI back in the 90s. So we continue to climb that scale. But again, when we think about this footprint, it's not just the resiliency of the forest. It's not just the amount of carbon stored there, but it also comes down to practices and what we're doing on the ground and how do we know those things can have that positive climate effect that we're reaching for. So again, let's look to our collaborations. We've worked with the University of Maine. As a matter of fact, we're just finishing up some work with the University of Maine now, looking at the effect of forest management on soils. This work has looked at various setups, various places that have been harvested and how the harvest operations have affected soil carbon and how it in particular can affect the movement of carbon from the upper layer of soils into the deeper soils to essentially enhance carbon storage. This work has also pointed us to some new practices that we've been able to suggest to certified organizations to reduce their impact on soils and to therefore maintain more soil or carbon in those soils over the long term. We've also worked with American Forests. They did some great work for us a few years ago, 2 different projects. One was looking at, again, related to carbon in soils, what the various land uses are that affect carbon in soils and which ones are good and bad and how you can avoid negative implications for soils. And they also did a great project where they looked at various practices and their likelihood of affecting soil carbon to give basically a menu to certified organizations that they can draw on as they develop their management plans and approaches. And this is all about finding ways to manage that landscape more appropriately to reduce carbon losses from soils in particular. But even then, once you've got all these practices, if certified organizations aren't drawn to them, if they aren't motivated to use these new practices, what do you do? So for those of you who have been tracking this, SFI recently completed and released our new standards. The SFI 2022 standards that you see here are 4 different standards: the forest management standard, the fiber sourcing standard, chain of custody, as well as certified sourcing standards. So this has been a 2-year process with literally thousands of pieces of information from thousands of people who participated in doing this. We're very proud of these new standards, and for those of you who are using them or are looking to use them, there are a number of new enhancements to it. Particularly, I want to draw your attention here to Objective 9, Climate Smart Forestry, and Objective 10, which is Fire Resilience and Awareness. And those two new objectives are brand new to the standard. They were not here before. These are not enhancements. They are absolutely new pieces. I had the privilege of working with my colleagues at SFI and certified organizations and conservation organizations to develop the climate smart forestry specifically. So I'll give you a little overview of how those work and how those are used to enhance the use of these new practices. Climate smart forestry in particular, as we've already said, and both Ronnie and Werner talked about this, the forests do play this critical role in addressing climate change and storing carbon. There's obviously an increased focus on climate and understanding that forests give SFI with our scale a great opportunity to play an important role in mitigating climate. And we knew when we started this process that elements of the previous standard already aided in addressing climate resiliency, reforestation, and forest health. Some of the things that Ronnie mentioned, such as not converting forests, that was part of our standard before. Prompt regeneration, that was part of our standard before. But we really wanted to go to the next level and find what more could we do to push this agenda. So the new climate smart forestry, which I don't want to move now, we have two components to it. One is asking our certified organizations, again, thinking about that climate resiliency piece, to identify and address climate change risks. What is likely to happen on their managed forests that they're going to have to deal with, and develop adaptation strategies to mitigate those risks. The second piece is to ask our certified organizations to identify and address opportunities to both increase carbon sequestration where that's possible, and then to reduce emissions from equipment, for example, which has also been mentioned. Find ways to reduce your emissions from your machinery, your operations, while at the same time finding ways to increase sequestration. And both of these elements of the objective have reporting requirements to SFI so that we can communicate that out and transparently show what certified organizations are doing to push this. When it comes to fire resiliency and awareness, I really don't need to talk about why it matters here. Werner did a great job of emphasizing this, talking about the link between wildfires and climate and the instant emissions that are caused. We know this is an increasing problem and we need to help fight it. So as part of our standard revision, we included a piece there. Again, this has two components. One is to require SFI certified organizations on the lands that they own or manage to limit susceptibility, find ways to reduce the undesirable impacts of wildfire, to promote healthy and resilient forests. Essentially, we want to cut back on the amount of fire that we see on managed landscapes any way we possibly can, and then to promote restoration and future forest resilience going forward. The second component is to work with the communities that they are operating with to both engage individually and through cooperative efforts to raise awareness of fire risks and fire management so that citizens who are operating on those landscapes can participate actively in reducing that fire risk to their forests and to their community. Again, this is all about minimizing the undesirable impacts of wildfire and the concomitant carbon emissions, water quality effects, air quality effects, and so on. So again, this new objective has a reporting requirement to SFI so we can communicate what is going on. When we think about adaptation or mitigation, these are some of the forest practices, but there would also be, things that we can do, again, in terms of reducing emissions from operations and whatnot. But you can see that some things like thinning or reducing fuel loads or improving stand health, those actually transmit to both adaptation and mitigation. So there's a number of sort of increased bang for your buck that you can get from some of these practices that will really help meet these objectives and help in our fight against the risks of climate change. So to wrap this up, we know the sustainably managed forests fight climate change through these different avenues, whether it's broad scale requirements for climate adaptation mitigation or fire event reduction, the reduction in carbon intense product use, which I don't need to go into that. Werner did a great job of covering that. The application of climate smart forest management practices with documented benefits. This is not just about telling folks to go out there and do stuff, but actually looking at what those benefits are. And then further doing more research to find new methods and practices. Sustainably managed forests, it's all about continual improvement, and we hope to get there. This paper, this Ontel et al. 2020, this is the paper that I talked about. If you want to go look this one up, this has all that menu of forest practices that can be applied and their likely carbon benefits. So with that, I guess I will be handing it back to Malcolm.
Thank you, Dr. Sleep. Fantastic, thank you. Our final speaker this afternoon is Ben Filewad, and then we will proceed to the question session. Ben is an economic researcher working on forest sector development and green finance. He has worked as a tree planter in Ontario and as a forestry engineer in British Columbia. And Mr. Filewad spent several years in Ottawa, which happens to be his hometown, as the industry lead for climate change under the Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement and as an advisor to the Forest Products Association of Canada. Over to you, Mr. Filewad.
Thanks. I'm afraid my slides are not nearly as gorgeous as the ones we've just seen, so I'm maybe a little disappointing to finish with, but I'll try to entertain you anyway. So can you see, are you seeing just my image, or can you see the title slide right now?
Looks good, Ben.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to talk about financing the transition to climate smart forestry. And thanks to Darren for just having, given us an introduction as to what climate smart forestry is, mitigation and adaptation. So I'll talk just briefly about what's going on with climate finance, about current prices for carbon offsets, which is the main mechanism whereby climate finance could unlock some of this mitigation potential and adaptation improvement that we've been talking about. And then I'll close with some thoughts about the outlook for Canadian forest offsets. But I wanted to start by talking a little bit about forest sector development, which is something that I worked on a lot. And I think it's important to remember when we think about transitioning to climate smart forestry to forestry, which is, mitigates more or is more adaptive, we consider the evolving economic background against which this transition is occurring and doesn't happen in a vacuum. And in light of that observation, I think it's important to recognize that Canada, when it comes to industrial forestry, is an undeveloped country, or at least an underdeveloped country. And I know that's not usually how we think of ourselves. So what I mean by this is that Canadian industrial forestry is still reliant on low-cost first pass or sometimes second pass forests. Our forests are quite low in productivity. We don't put a lot of inputs into them to boost that productivity. So, meters cubed produced per hectare cleared. And we're focused economically primarily on exporting low value added products. And I know there's obviously many initiatives that are trying to change this course. So to make this a bit more concrete, I wanted to share a couple figures from some research I was doing over the summer looking at forest sector development paths. The figure on the left is showing the results of a clustering exercise. If you try to come up with variables that describe the outcomes of development in forestry, and then you score major forested countries on those variables, and then you sort them, you can start classifying different countries as being at different development stages. So the variables that I'm using here, the fraction of original forest cover remaining, the accessibility of forests, the fraction planted, area under management, the productivity of harvest, and economic specialization and exports of high or low value added products. And here I've just sort of reduced the dimensionality of that. So the clusters are color coded. And if you evaluate the development of countries this way, what you find is that Canada has some surprising neighbors. Canada has binned in with countries like Congo DRC and Papua New Guinea or Brazil. This is not usually the company that we think we keep when we think about the state of development in Canada. But for the Canadian forest sector, described with these variables, we look more like those countries than we do like other advanced economies, which are mostly in the red blob on the left there. That's where all of Europe is, the United States, Japan. Of course, this multidimensional idea of forest sector development, it might seem a little arbitrary. So to make it a bit more concrete, I wanted to give you the figure on the right as well, which is looking at the share of value chain income accruing to different countries and comparing it to the share of roundwood produced by those countries. So value chain income is the total economic benefit accruing to countries from the consumption of forest products anywhere in the world. So that's not just the direct values in the sale of the forest products, it's also everything indirect throughout the supply chain of consultancy services, machinery, accounting, etc. So the ratio in US dollars of economic benefit accruing to countries, US dollars to meters cubed of roundwood produced for Canada, average over the 2000 to 2014 period, which is the most recent for which the necessary databases are available, For Canada, it's about 28.9 US dollars per meter cube, total direct and indirect benefit. For the USA, it's 80.2, and for Germany, 185.5. So you can see here in this figure, we're right down on the bottom left end of it, beside Russia and China. And so we are producing proportionally more of the world's wood and receiving proportionately less of the economic benefits from the consumption of the world's wood. So when we talk about climate finance driving a transition to climate smart forestry, we're also driving a transition to advanced forestry, more investment, more inputs, more labor, more data, more capital. And I think it's important to recognize this, for climate finance to develop and to deliver the increased efficiency that we need to achieve sustainability, we need to be pushing this transition forwards. So what's happening in climate finance at the moment? Well, 2021 was a big year. The headline news, of course, was the climate change conference in Glasgow in the fall, COP26. And COP26 saw agreement on a key part of the Paris framework that matters for forests and carbon finance. And this is Article 6, which covers cooperative approaches, generally read as international emissions trading. So in Glasgow, some of the rules for Article 6 were pinned down. And it was decided that there'd be 3 pathways through which international emissions trading could operate in the international climate change mitigation regime. And so 6.2 provides for bilateral actions, one country to another. 6.4 provides a multilateral mechanism to replace the CDM that existed under Kyoto. And 6.8 allows for non-market international approaches. There's still a lot that's not precise in the Article 6 rulebook and in the Paris rules. So some takeaways, voluntary markets are not explicitly considered under Article 6, but they may follow signals from the Article 6 regime. Emissions avoidance, so reductions of emissions against a projected baseline, as opposed to reducing existing emissions that we know about for sure, or enhancing sinks were left out. And REDD+, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, was in. So probably a lot more emphasis on jurisdictional large-scale REDD projects than before, and definitely a lot of excitement around forests and climate finance coming out of Glasgow. This will matter for Canada basically through influences on norms and the way we do accounting and the protocols we develop that allow finance to connect to specific offset projects. That means to connect concretely to mitigation gains in the forest sector. The other thing coming out of Glasgow to be aware of was no deforestation commitments. The Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forests and Land Use. You may have heard of the 2014 New York Declaration on Forests, which was a high-profile sort of pledge to stop deforestation. Deforestation has continued in the intervening 8 years. And there is this other declaration at Glasgow, 141 countries covering 90% of the world's forests coming together and saying, we want to halt deforestation now. And they put some money in the pot to try to back that up. There are also a lot of high-profile net zero commitments. You're probably all aware of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, led by Mark Carney. So that's 450 financial institutions with 130 trillion US dollars under management. So for comparison, these numbers are kind of hard to wrap your head around. The world GDP in 2021 was about 85 or 90 trillion dollars. So these institutions managing 130 trillion are committing to a net zero profile going forward. How are they going to do that? Well, they can divest, they can try to stop funding high emissions activities, but they are also going to have to purchase offsets. Corsia was another high-profile example. This is an offsetting scheme for civil aviation, and the Civil Aviation International Authority has declared that all growth in emissions from civil aviation, so non-commercial flights, is going to be net zero going forwards against the 2019-2020 baseline, and they're going to achieve that through some improvements in efficiency of airplanes, but also through offsetting. So a big source of demand right there. Based on all of these, and there'll be more, the Watch This Space bullet just references, international maritime shipping might do something like Corsia. So all this enthusiasm around achieving net zero and the high importance of offsets, and specifically of forest offsets in the international policy arena. The International Emissions Trading Association, based in DC, has forecast US 1 trillion of climate finance flowing by 2050. So that's obviously quite speculative, but there's definitely an expectation that there will be a lot of money looking to invest. This all operates within the sort of mitigation hierarchy, and Ronnie touched on that, reducing first and offsetting only the things you can't reduce. The other big picture thing to be aware of is the conversation is starting to shift from a purely carbon lens to a more holistic lens. People talk more about natural capital now. So not just carbon offsets, but also how are you managing biodiversity, how are you managing ecosystem services, all those other things that ecosystems provide are coming more and more on stage. So to get high quality offsets, you need to be able to pay for them. And I thought it'd be useful to just briefly take a look at prices at the moment in offset markets. So current prices for carbon offsets. Well, in Canada, we have the federal output-based pricing system, which operates as a backstop. And the price in 2022 will hit 50 Canadian a ton. We don't yet have a protocol for forests, so the ones under development. Past payments in RED Plus scheme, so this is the reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, have been more like $5 US a ton, and there's sometimes the idea of 10 has been floated for higher quality offsets. But what we've seen in the past, like Norway Gabon or Global Environmental Facility in Indonesia, payments about 5 a ton. Voluntary markets also seeing about 5 a ton. In 2021, the mean price for forest and land use offsets in the voluntary markets was $4.73. And I guess I should just remind us all the distinction between a voluntary and a compliance market. The latter, you're obligated in some way to reduce your emissions or have a certain emissions profile, and you're buying compliance credits that meet a legal obligation, whereas voluntary credits are being bought just to make claims about your sustainability. So companies might buy a voluntary credit to say, look, we are fairly sustainable, you should continue to buy our product, even if they're not regulated or forced to do so. So these prices are fairly low. For comparison, Ronnie was talking about low cost mitigation under $100. I was involved in a study in the last couple of years led by Emily Hope at the Forest Service here, well, in Sault Ste. Marie. I'm in Ottawa right now, but in that study, we checked the financials for a representative afforestation project with red pine in southern Ontario, 100 hectares, red pine, maybe with harvest, maybe without. Tried accounting for the mitigation under a different accounting rules. So kind of trying to represent different types of protocols that might be used to capture the changes in the biophysical system, because you can have the same change can be valued differently depending on the protocol that you use to account for the change. So we played with those variables. We found break-even prices for a afforestation project of about 54 to 183 a ton Canadian. So lower than the prices we've seen now, but 54, we're starting to get there with the federal backstop price. Critically, we expect prices to go up. So the price forecast of the federal system has a legislated $15 a year increase to 2030, hitting a high of 170 Canadian per year in 2030. And because I'm in Ottawa right now, I couldn't resist this little graphic. That's a legislated price, and legislation is not set in stone. So we've all probably been seeing what's going on in the news and here in Ottawa over the last couple of weeks. On Wednesday, the interim leader of the Conservative Party walked back the O'Toole leadership's commitment to carbon pricing that he made during the last election campaign. So the Canadian backstop price, we expect it to increase, but things could change. It's a politically driven price. Another metric we can use to look at price forecasts is the social cost of carbon. And this is a key number that economists look at to try to understand how much an incremental ton of emissions today costs society when you run it into the future and you account for all the climate impacts that come from that one more ton of CO2 in the atmosphere and the slight increase in warming. And the US administration, the Biden administration, on Joe Biden's first day in office, signed back US 51 as the social cost of carbon that they're using. But the social cost of carbon probably will increase as climate change impacts increase. Unfortunately, it's quite uncertain because it's based on a lot of very complicated modeling, and there's a ton of methodological choices to be made. So I pulled a recent review paper when thinking about this, and the forecasts in that one are ranging from -50 to almost $9,000 for a ton of carbon. But you'll notice that skews more towards the high positive side. So the social cost of carbon is what the price of an efficient carbon offset should be. And we expect that to be pretty high and going up going forwards. So we expect upside potential in carbon prices, and this should hopefully bring some of the good things that we want to do in Canadian forestry onto the table, make them economically viable. So I wanted to wrap up with talking about the role for Canadian forest offsets, because I've been talking, my second slide there about the international climate change mitigation regime. And when people think about forests and forest carbon, they're often thinking about the tropics. They're thinking about frontier forests in Amazonia, in the Central Africa, the Congo Basin and surroundings, and think about Southeast Asia, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, Malaysia. They're usually not thinking about developed countries like Canada. And that's probably going to continue. So if you're interested in creating forest carbon offsets in Canada as a way of financing transitions to climate smart forestry, to adaptive forestry or higher mitigation in forestry, is probably going to be domestic buyers that you're looking for. Canadian forest offsets are likely to be bought domestically going forward. So we've had some important bilateral one-offs here in Canada. BC's being a leader in the space. BC funded by government purchases of offsets to make government operations come closer to net zero. They funded the Pluto Darkwood Conservation purchase a long time ago with the Nature Conservancy, and then partially funded the Great Bear Rainforest, the surrender of timber concessions there. There's also a lot of interest from corporate ESG, environmental, social, and governance initiatives. And here, like with other, this is a voluntary commitment. This is companies wanting to do things to make themselves look good. And there's definitely a focus on co-benefits, because if you can pay $5 for carbon, or you can pay $5 for carbon plus biodiversity plus something else, you'll do the latter. So this is, as with all voluntary offsets, something to be aware of. The carbon offset projects that can offer compelling co-benefits fetch a higher price and are bought, whereas others languish on the market. In terms of just purely carbon, the development of compliance protocols is going to be key. So what happens with Canadian cap and trade and the development of offsets that link forest changes in forest management regimes to quantified emissions reductions and their trade within a cap and trade scheme. So, Quebec's Western Climate Initiative is linked with California and has been doing this sort of thing for a while. Federally, there's a federal improved forest management protocol in development there's a panel of advisors, and we're trying to put in input to it and come up with a really good protocol. It's taking a while. When it is developed, there will be a public consultation that you can look at. BC has previously done this. Here in Ontario, the emissions performance system, the Made in Ontario version, has officially replaced the backstop output-based pricing system as of January 1st. No policy and offsets yet, and they say they're watching federal developments. But I just want to leave you with the thought that in Canada, we have a pretty good forest management regime, and we're a relatively rich country. And so the offsets that people are going to want to buy from Canada, whether we're getting them domestically or maybe some interest from buyers abroad, maybe through linked cap and trade systems like what Quebec has had, the interest is going to be on high quality offsets. And buyers are willing to fund lower quality offsets when there's no other option to fix a problem, as it's the case with tropical deforestation. But here in Canada, I think it's really important that we focus on the highest quality projects possible. And so Ronnie touched on some of the key concepts to think about when thinking about high quality offsets. And I don't think I have time to go through them really in detail, but a real offset, it has to be an additional change, something that wouldn't have happened without the offset money. It has to be permanent, and Werner's presentation raised some really interesting questions about the permanence of forest offsets in Canada. And it has to not be leaky. So if you have an offset in one place, it has to not result in increased emissions somewhere else. And these three concepts work in sometimes surprising ways when you think about particular categories of IFM projects. So for instance, old growth forest set-asides, definitely that can preserve carbon and prevent emissions, but if the logging then moves elsewhere, you have to account for that in the protocol that you develop. It's very complicated to do this accurately. And I think I will leave it there, and maybe we can get into some more of this in the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Filewood. Great presentation as well. I'll now invite all the speakers or panelists to turn on their cameras as well as their mics. Okay, and that includes Mr. Filewood. Perfect. Okay, great presentations, gentlemen. Very interesting and many questions in the chat. As I said at the beginning, we're going to prioritize the questions that were posted in the chat, although I do personally hope I get to ask one or two myself. So our first question is going to Dr. Kurtz, and I'll read out the question. Dr. Kurtz, you mentioned that harvested wood products a few times in your presentation are important, but the question is, how important are harvested wood products in quantifying Canada's carbon balance, and what issues or challenges could there be in including them over time?
Thank you, Malcolm, and whoever wrote the question. That's an excellent question. And so first of all, starting at the back, and to clarify, we do include harvested wood products in our greenhouse gas emissions estimation and reporting. So they're already included. And the reason they are included is because in Canada, the carbon dioxide equivalent contained in the annual harvest that's just the wood that we extract from the forest, is about 175 million tons of CO2. So how we use this wood matters greatly. You may remember that in the 96 revised inventory guidelines of the IPCC, there was still the assumption that all wood that is harvested is instantly oxidized to the atmosphere. And so obviously that carbon is not lost to the atmosphere. And so we have for years worked with the scientific community to develop tools and the capability to allow us to better track the fate of the carbon. And we do that using a framework that keeps track of all the carbon that is harvested in Canada's forests. And that is then used to produce a series of commodities, such as pulp and paper, panels, sawnwood, other industrial roundwood, and including tracking residential firewood uses. And what we find is that the carbon stocks in these commodities produced from wood and harvested in Canada are actually increasing. And so the harvested wood products themselves, I wouldn't think of them as a sink. They just store additional carbon that was removed from the atmosphere by forests. So it's the forest that provides the sink function. We then harvest and store it in products. But what that also already clearly demonstrates is that how we use the wood matters. So if we, for example, were to increase the harvest to produce pellets and export them to Europe, what that would do is that we would have to report the emissions associated with the burning of the pellets in Europe, while allowing them to reduce their energy uses and fossil fuel, coal uses, and reduce the emissions that they have to report, because then they don't have to report the fossil fuel emissions, while we in Canada have to report the emissions from the burning of the pellets. So when we do the analyses of mitigation options, we've clearly demonstrated that, things like mass timber building, cross-laminated timber, big glulam beams, all these things not only store carbon for a long time, but also provide large substitution benefits. And that brings me to the point that Ben just made. Yes, storing carbon in forests is not necessarily a permanent solution, but using wood to achieve substitution benefits is indeed considered a permanent solution, or the avoided emission from not having used the cement is considered a permanent emission avoidance. Now, the last point is that when we do analyses with our harvested wood products models, we track the carbon stored in the products. We also, for the purpose of analyzing alternative mitigation options, calculate substitution benefits. So if we used more wood instead of steel and concrete, what would be the impact be on the atmosphere? But as Ben just pointed out, there are questions of leakage and elasticity of markets. So when we do mitigation analyses, we include substitution benefits. When we do the reporting to the United Nations Framework Convention, we do not include the substitution benefits, because if they are real and where they are real, they will express themselves in reduced emissions in other sectors, in the steel production or the cement manufacturing, et cetera. So it's important to understand that, because people are often criticized when they make some assumptions about substitution benefits and they change over time and elasticity of markets, et cetera, et cetera. We only use that to assess alternative mitigation options. Their substitution benefits themselves are not reported in the greenhouse gas inventories unless they are real and verifiable through reductions in emissions in the other sectors where we have reduced their consumption. So it was a bit long answer, but it's a very complicated issue. And I think it's really important for us to understand that there are tremendous mitigation options in how we use wood in the future, and that we need to look at.
That's great, Dr. Kurtz. Yeah, I think the take-home message that I gathered was it's in the bigger context of the materials that are being replaced and the broader sector. So that's helpful.
Correct. Yes.
The next question, and it kind of is in the same theme of how these offsets or reduced emissions are being calculated, and it's for Dr. Drever, and it's with respect to the natural climate solutions that you were speaking to. What are some of the metrics that are used to ensure additionality, and how is additionality defined? Does it differ for each nature-based solution, or is it consistent across the board?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. I mean, I guess the first thing I'll do is I'll distinguish between carbon offsets which are a financial mechanism to pay for some of these things, versus the natural climate solution itself, which is achieves its own action, irrespective of whether or not it's offset or not. So it's important to, a lot of people kind of conflate the two, but they're actually quite separate issues. They're worth keeping apart. In terms of additionality, I mean, it's a complicated topic, but really the short answer is it materially different from what happened in the past? So Keith, so it's really, it's not, it's either additional or not, or it's often more of somewhere you have to build an evidence base for additionality. Key things that rule out things being additional is it required by law already, for instance. So tree planting after logging isn't additional because that's already required by the provinces and other forest management agencies. Tree planting in where forests used to be, but they're not now, say, so low quality agricultural fields, that would be additional because you're not required by law already to conduct that activity. In terms of actually measuring additionality, it's different for each natural climate solution pathway, but the typical approach is that you take your business as usual, and because these are forward-looking estimates, you take your business as usual case and you model that forward, and then you take your intervention or your natural climate solution scenario and you model that forward. So the additionality would be the difference between your modeled intervention and your business as usual intervention. Yeah, I guess there's a lot more to be said about that, but yeah, so new practices, new protections, for instance, so putting a new protected area where there wasn't one before would be considered additional. Practices that weren't done in the past would be considered additional. New partners, that were brought into the conversation could be considered as evidence of additionality. The difference, again, being that we want to build an evidence case for something that's qualitatively different and quantitatively, in some cases, for what happened in the past.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Dr. Drever. So maybe let's twist that question and put it to Dr. Sleep and Mr. Filewad, which is, landowners that either own a woodlot or are SFI certified. When can they, how and when can they expect to demonstrate additionality? And let's talk specifically about Canada, where a compliance protocol is much anticipated. So perhaps we'll put it to Dr. Sleep first, and then Ben, you can speak to some of the points that you made.
It's a really good question, Malcolm. In particular, one of the things that we've encountered through the revisions of our standard and the Climate Smart Forestry objective is that we got initial pushback. There was some fears that adhering to the new SFI standard would mean you must have additional carbon sequestration, you must increase your carbon footprint, and therefore some of the companies who are already engaged with carbon offsets would therefore be ineligible because it would no longer be additional. Because if they were meeting their certification, they would get that additionality and it would be built in. So there was a lot of concern around that. So we had to be very clear in our standard that the SFI standard is not a carbon accounting scheme. We don't force you to, add up your carbon, and you're not necessarily forced to increase your carbon sequestration. We're asking you to be better prepared for climate change, find ways to reduce emissions, and possibly increase sequestration, but you're not required to as part of the standard. And that was a very deliberate avoidance of getting in the way of potential investments like climate offsets. So that's a key, I think, piece of the conversation, is that certification does not guarantee additionality for that very reason. As for what we're seeing in terms of the analysis we're doing both in the US and Canada, and I think this comports a lot with Werner's work, is that managed forest areas, certified areas that we're seeing are showing increases in carbon over time, both in biogenic carbon and obviously in terms of harvested forest products. So we're seeing that. It will really be a question of for individual landowners, especially in the carbon market system, if they're going to track that additionality, they're going to have to do the analysis to understand how their new practices that they're bringing in will increase that carbon, and then demonstratively prove that to carbon offsetting organizations.
That's great, Dr. Sleep. Thanks. And Mr. Filewad, similar kind of question. Maybe I'll qualify it a little bit to be of particular interest to probably most of the audience members who tend to be smaller forest owners as opposed to big industrial ones. You commented on the status of the politics around a compliance protocol in Canada. What can we expect?
I'm not sure I can forecast the outcome of the next federal election. There will be a compliance protocol. It's going to be difficult for smallholders, I think, to use. I don't mean by design, but there's just more cost barriers when you're a smallholder. Monitoring, reporting, and verification to make sure that you're in compliance with the protocol costs money, and there's economies of scale in that. So the way to handle this in a compliance protocol design is to try to allow for the agglomeration of projects. So a bunch of smallholders can come together and they can share the costs of having an auditor come in for a day and check everything out. The additionality question is really difficult, and it relates to how you account for what your baseline is fundamentally. So Darren Darren's comment put me in mind of perverse incentives that have been studied in economics. In some cases, the thought that there will be a future carbon market has led people to not want to act in a mitigating way, because if they did it now, their baseline would shift and they wouldn't get credit for having acted soon, which is obviously a problem. But the common way would be to look at economic incentives for smallholders. So what has been happening in that region given timber prices, and how do you think that will go in the future? You use projections of prices, projections of demand, and try to understand the likely behavior of individuals going ahead. This is really complicated to do accurately. Economics is not physics, although we use a lot of the same machinery. It doesn't, I mean, human behavior is not so precise, so we can come up with estimates, but a conservative and careful policy design needs to structure in the ability to be wrong and does not get your mitigation numbers wrong because your estimates of future human behavior are wrong, because people are hard to predict. So people often try to fall back on kind of foolproof things like, they call them foolproof, but the average behavior or average market prices, and you pick sort of a baseline in time. But we haven't worked this out. You may have heard about the California Air Resources Board. California has an offset system whereby forest managers can make changes in their management and sell offsets to power plants and other large emitting facilities. A paper came out just this past summer in Global Change Biology pointing out that about 50% of the projects, accounting for about 30% of the credits in that system, were getting additional sequestration just by a quirk in the accounting rules, because they were using regional baselines to determine the baseline sequestration, and this led to an inflated estimates of project proponents preferentially located their projects in higher carbon density forests. So you create these systems, and then people are incentivized to find ways to make the most money off of them, and this can lead to bad outcomes. So it's very difficult to do well. It's not a clear answer, I'm afraid.
No. I think that is informative. I think all of this provides clarity that many folks in the audience wouldn't otherwise have. That kind of transition is not with respect to the gerrymandering, let's say, of carbon offset projects, but more broadly the way that data is collected. To another question that was posted for Dr. Kurtz, and it's with the presentation that you made. A member of the audience was wondering how important site-specific sampling is when it comes to carbon flux monitoring as compared to remote sensing. So when trying to calculate these things, how is boots on the ground site specific rank relative to remote sensing tools?
Excellent question, and I would argue, first of all, that both matter. We can't get improved remote sensing information without calibration sites on the ground that allow us to train our machine learning algorithms to make the best available use of remote sensing data. That's the first point. The second point is there are different tools that allow us to answer different questions. So the question addresses flux measurements. So flux measurements can only be made with what are called flux towers. These are very expensive scientific instruments that, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars to install and maintain one of those towers over multiple years. And so there have been only a very small number. They give us very good data, in particular about sort of hourly and sub-hourly variation in fluxes due to changes in environmental conditions and microclimate, et cetera, which is really cool information if you want to understand the response of an ecosystem to environmental drivers, but makes it really hard to extrapolate to the whole of the country. So permanent sample plots are sort of in the middle, because now you have thousands of plots across the country. They give you more informed data. And now, very recently, we have been able to get access to remote sensing data that now cover the country at sub-hectare scales. The Landsat time series that are now available are at 30-meter resolution, where we were constrained by our modeling capabilities to accommodate such volumes of data. You can imagine 30-meter resolution for the whole of the country in annual time steps. We're talking petabytes of data here. But we have anticipated this for the last few years and have been developing a model that I was referring to in my presentation called the generic carbon budget model. It's designed to ingest very large volumes of data. And we can now, and we did some project with Darren and SFI and FPAC in the last couple of years, and we're doing it for all of British Columbia. And some of the work that we did with Ronnie was done with the same modeling tool. We can now do analyses at 30-meter or 1 hectare resolution over very large areas. We're not quite there yet for the whole of the country, but we can do it over, I think we've done well over 150 million hectares now in total. And that opens up totally new opportunities, because now we can look at much finer resolution information about forest characteristics and their changes over time. And the interesting thing is that some of the remote sensing data are actually indicating a much bigger carbon sink or increase in above ground biomass carbon stocks than we're currently estimating. And one of the things we're doing with the remote sensing community is trying to better understand, what is it that these remote sensing data see and are estimating that could be something that we're missing, or are there other reasons for these discrepancies? We don't have an answer yet, but it's an area of very active research. And so I'm very excited about the opportunities that the remote sensing data that now become available will offer to us. And I think somebody mentioned earlier the work with World Wildlife Fund and McMaster University. We're working with that group as well very closely. We just had a paper out that shows how some of these remote sensing data with machine learning algorithms can be used to help improve these estimates. So it's a pretty exciting time in the carbon science community. It seems like it always is, but I think we will see really exciting new information with these remote sensing data in the future.
Great, thanks, Dr. Kurtz. I would invite any of the other panelists, if you had a further comment to the same topic, please feel free to chime in on that particular point. But if not, that's fine. The next question is in the same kind of theme, and it's for Ronnie. And your table of natural climate solutions was popular, but I think a member of the audience several members of the audience were curious as to just how did you come up with that particular list that populates that table?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Really, it was part of the search for experts in the field. And based on that, search started with the literature. And so we did an extensive literature search on what evidence existed already for the potential for natural climate solutions. We then engaged the experts and those that wanted to join us in the journey. Essentially, we created these subgroups that each of them sort of defined the pathways of interest. So the criteria, principal criterion was what evidence exists already for it. And then the research process itself involved a standardization of the modeling approaches and the assumptions and that kind of thing. But really, to answer the question, it was what evidence exists already in that respect, and what did the researchers think would be high potential pathways of interest. I will say that this was a comprehensive assessment, but it really was one of the first that tried to do this in Canada in this sort of multi-sectoral way. But we didn't look at all the pathways. I think there's still lots. This is going to sound like a try from researcher, but there's more research to be done. And in particular, I think one of the things I'm really interested in is the type of permanence issues that have been raised a couple of times already in this forum, and that Werner raised rather soberly in his discussion about essentially the increasing fire risk in Canada, which I feel compelled to make a kind of an important point that yes, fire risk in Canada is increasing, but not everywhere and all at the same rate. That's very important, and we saw that in the paper that I haven't seen the Sharma paper yet, Werner, but it looks interesting to read. That really the fire signal, the signal of change was really important in the West. And so this increased fire risk is happening primarily in the provinces west of Manitoba, in forests that are already really under climate change. It is happening a lot in the dry forests of central interior BC. But fire risk isn't increasing everywhere in Canada. In fact, places in the eastern Canada, fire risk is going down. And so we see that in temperate forests of Ontario and Quebec. We see that in the temperate forest of British Columbia, for instance. So these are places where conservation and protection of the existing carbon stock are really important. And so those are sort of more safer bets that we should focus in on. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. That point about regionality is really interesting, and it raises a question for Dr. Sleep, which is, Dr. Drever, you spoke to regionality with respect to where these impacts are occurring. Dr. Sleep, during your presentation, you spoke to the many efforts going on across the forestry sector of North America towards climate change mitigation or adaptation. What kind of trends are you seeing in regionality with respect to those efforts with the different companies you work with?
That's a great question, Malcolm, and I completely agree that regionality, that's one of the things that we require within the new standard under the Climate Smart Forestry objective, is to look at regional models and what is expected to happen in your landscape. We're not asking, someone operating anywhere in the boreal forests of Canada to, compare themselves to climate risks in coastal BC. Obviously, that's not the same regionality. So what we are seeing is that in places where maybe fire risk is incredibly low, you are finding people, trying to identify, as Ronnie put it, those high carbon areas on their landscape and trying to prioritize those for multiple overlaps of various conservation values. If that can be a habitat use, if that's a riparian area, if that's cultural set aside, all these different things, if that could all be in, on those higher carbon areas, great, that's fantastic. And then they can manage in other places. But in other parts of the country where fire risk is an issue, it becomes a matter of focusing effort on reducing fire and changing their practices in that in light of what they're expecting from various disturbances.
Great, thank you. Then taking that same theme, because there's a few questions in the chat that continue on the regionality theme, and this one's for Ben, and it's with respect to the regionality of carbon credits and the desirability of those carbon credits from different regions around the world. Some people in the chat were wondering if it's expected that Canadian buyers will prefer a domestic offset versus one from the tropics or somewhere else, and could you provide more color on that point?
Sure, and I think it's all down to the institutional frameworks you have in place. Ronnie made this point earlier, but if you do something to the physical world, you change an ecosystem somehow, you change your management somehow, there's some real physical change that happens. We perceive that in different ways depending on the institutional frameworks we have for crediting it and accounting for it. So in the case of where is demand going to come from for Canada, domestic compliance protocols, I think, is going to be that seems like the big driver demand, and then domestic corporate sustainability, like voluntary claims, could be a big driver demand. But when the world thinks about forest carbon finance and forest carbon credits, they're not thinking about Canada. They're thinking about tropical nations that are converting rainforest for commodity agriculture. That's where the world's attention is. But Canada has the opportunity to create its own demand, through such things as a compliance protocol in the output-based system.
Great, thanks, Ben. Another question that's in the chat that's been hanging out there for a while is continuing on a fairly consistent theme of wildfires. It's come up in all of your comments, and the question is that the United States recently released its wildfire crisis strategy, and the strategy commits $50 billion over 10 years. The question is if Canada has something similar, and if it doesn't, should it, and what would that look like? Maybe the best place to start with this question is with Dr. Kurtz, and then we can share it around.
Yeah, so it's always difficult if a federal government scientist steps into the policy domain and tells governments what they should or should not be doing. But first of all, yes, Canada already has committed significant funds to various fire and fire prevention and firefighting. So both the preventative actions and suppression efforts I don't have the number in my head, $35 million or something like that over multiple years have been committed in a previous budget, and work is progressing on that. Some of it goes to equipment, some of it goes to research. I know that British Columbia and other provinces are actively looking at that as well. I do not know how far they are, but I think what is happening very clearly is that the last 5 years of, 3 years with mega fires, just in Canada alone, and very bad outcomes in the US as well, has led to a growing awareness that what we have done so far, which is maximizing how much coniferous timber stock is in the landscape and fighting fires for over a century, combined with climate change impacts, is leading to a situation that is no longer tenable, is no longer sustainable. And so what we see, whether that's what Darren presented or the work that we're doing with the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions or other work that's ongoing in the US, everybody is beginning to realize that there needs to be a paradigm shift. There needs to be a new way in which we approach this. The $50 billion in the US, as far as I understand, is in a budget proposal. It's not yet committed. I think $3 billion were committed. The rest of it is pending approval of budgets, and we know how difficult that is at the moment. Bottom line is, yes, we need to collectively think about how we can increase forest resilience, and it is a regionally differentiated discussion that needs to be held very carefully. And it must not become an excuse by industry to say, oh, we got to log this all before it burns. I'm not accusing industry of doing that. Actually, the opposite is happening. They're already being accused of taking that approach. But the bottom line is, it will require a refocus from a timber provision to an ecosystem management focus, and carbon sequestration, carbon removal from the atmosphere will increasingly become an objective of land management in Canada.
And there's an important role for deciduous trees in this.
Exactly.
The deciduous trees, aspen, birch, and arboreal forests, and they're a lot less fire prone than our conifers. So, using nature smartly, if you will, to essentially adjust and increase the abundance and distribution of deciduous trees or prolonged deciduous stages in our forest management approaches brings this positive benefit for climate in terms of reduced fire risk. So I think there's a lot of potential in that. And that's really, the evidence base is really low at the moment, but the potential for it is very high.
That's great, Dr. Drever. And then pivoting on that question, there's another one that's risen to the top. Your comment specifically about deciduous trees and broadleaves. The question that's risen to the top is phrased as, how would you suggest the stand level tree marking decisions be updated to reflect climate change mitigation values? I think that's a bit of an unfair question for a panel of this nature, because that's pretty technical broadleaf forestry stuff. But I'd toss it to Darren to ask, are there any specific in the deciduous forests of North America, are there any pretty granular specific actions that are being taken to increase the carbon sequestration of those stands?
Well, I'll immediately defer to the fact that I'm not a forester on the ground. I'm an ecologist and landscape guy, as are most of my colleagues here. So we don't really get into the one stand at a time. However, when we think about practices related to climate mitigation, it does come down to some degree at some scale to tree selection. So whether it's Ronnie's point about increasing deciduous trees on the landscape, or when we think about assisted migration and thinking about species that are more likely to do well in a warming climate, there's opportunities there that can be done at the stand scale to increase the northern expansion of some of our southern species that do better in a warming climate, if that's what the climate risk is, or to add, or maintain the trees, if you will, that do reduce fire risk across the landscape. So I think those are two really good examples of practices that can be done at the stand scale.
That's great. You pass as a forester. That's good. So we've got 1 minute left, and I'm gonna hoard the last question for myself, and I'm gonna ask for an answer from each of you. It's an answer in 10 seconds or less, a brief one, and it's basically, you've each spoken to your own professional expertise and the things that are occupying you or have occupied you for decades or years in any case. And the question that I'd like to ask for the benefit of the whole audience is, over the next 10 years, let's say, what's the number one thing that you want to accomplish, that you're working on that you're going to try to prioritize. And you can be as specific as you like, but keep it simple for a humble forester like me, so I can understand it. So I'll pose that question in order of how you spoke to Dr. Kurtz, then Dr. Drever, Dr. Sleep, and then Mr. Filewad. What's the number one thing that you're going to try to work on or accomplish over the next decade?
I think there are two related issues. One is to better integrate remote sensing information into our assessment systems and use that information to help understand how we can better design landscapes that are fire resilient and resilient to climate change impacts in order to maximize the ability of forests to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Kurtz. Dr. Drever, what's your number one for the next decade?
That's a tough one, Malcolm. I'll say I'm really interested in the intersect between the way that we think about natural climate solutions as a sort of climate solution, if you will, but the role that it can play in alleviating the other crisis that we haven't talked about, which is the biodiversity crisis. So these things can walk together quite well, but understanding how they do so cost effectively and where they can be most impactful is something that I can easily see myself working on for the next 10 years.
That's great. Thank you for that. And then Dr. Sleep, what's your number one priority for the next decade?
Certainly leaning into the fog of war, having no idea what my career is going to look like over the next 10 years. I'll say that over the last 2 years, having worked to develop the Climate Smart Forestry objective with SFI, we are now focused on rolling that out and trying to, get companies to really think long and hard about how to do climate adaptation and mitigation. There's a ton of work that has to be done there, and that sort of echoes some of the things that both Werner and Ronnie said in terms of make it happen. We need to figure out how to manage better in light of climate change and how to quantify those benefits so we understand. I mean, it's all about learning to do by doing and adaptive management and getting better at it.
Well said, Dr. Sleep. And then Mr. Filewad, what's your number one?
With relation to the things I talked about today, given that we are trying to harness capitalism's profit motive to ecosystems as a major means of mitigating climate change through a series of somewhat obscure rules and regulations for verification and quantification, I think it's really important that we get those rules right and that the results that we credit are correct and are real. So I'm going to be working on that for the foreseeable.
That's great. Good. Well, that's a wrap, and that's a great way to bookend it because it provides valuable context to the descriptions that you provided of the work that's been done to date. And I think everybody in the audience thanks you and wishes you the best of luck with achieving that number one priority and all the others that are on your list. So in wrapping up, I'll remind the guests that are in the audience that if they have additional questions or comments for the speakers, they can try to connect with each of the panelists by contacting them through the Event Mobi platform or potentially looking them up online and attempting to contact them that way. Thank you very much for joining us today, gentlemen. That's been a great discussion, and I know that I've certainly learned something, and I imagine everybody in the audience has too. And with that, we will sign off, turn off our cameras and our mics, and pass it back to the Chief Executive Officer of Forests Ontario, Rob Keane, in order that he may close the conference. Thank you.
Thanks, Malcolm.